Continuing Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough. We are still in Crassus. When their command was now ready to expire, and they were, as it happened, addressing the people, a Roman knight, one Anatius Aurelius, an ordinary private person living in the country, mounted the hustings and declared a vision he had in his sleep. Jupiter, said he, appeared to me and commanded me to tell you that you should not suffer your consuls to lay down their charge before they are made friends. When he had spoken, the people cried out that they should be reconciled. Pompey stood still and said nothing, but Crassus, first offering him his hand, said, I cannot think, my countrymen, that I do anything humiliating or unworthy of myself if I make the first offers of accommodation and friendship with Pompey, whom you are yourselves styled the Great, before he was of a man's estate, and decreed him a triumph before he was capable of sitting in the Senate. This is what was memorable in Crassus's consulship, but as for his censorship, that was altogether idle and inactive, for he neither made a scrutiny of the Senate, nor took a review of the horsemen, nor a census of the people, though he had as mild a man as could be desired for his colleague. Latatius Catullus, it is said indeed that when Crassus intended a violent and unjust measure, which was reducing Egypt to be tributary to Rome, Catullus strongly opposed it, and bawling out about it, they laid down their office by consent. In the great conspiracy of Catiline, which was very near subverting the government, Crassus was not without some suspicion of being concerned, and of one man came forward and declared him to be in the plot, but nobody credited him. Yet Cicero, in one of his orations, clearly charges both Crassus and Caesar with the guilt of it, though that speech was not published till they were both dead. But in his speech upon his consulship, he declares that Crassus came to him by night and brought a letter concerning Catiline, stating the details of the conspiracy. Crassus hated him ever after, but was hindered by his son from doing him any injury, for Publius was a great lover of learning and eloquence, and a constant follower of Cicero, insomuch that he put himself into mourning when he was accused, and induced the other young men to do the same, and at last he reconciled himself to his father. Now, if it's just, you shouldn't let your family stop you from handing out justice just because it doesn't please them. Nor should you let your mere, oh, well, I like him for this thing. It's like all these celebrities and, oh, but he's a really good singer, so what if he did that? So what if he did this? Are you kidding me? No. Even if overall, leave it up to divinity to judge, in the long run, but we know about this deed, so, but it's, first of all, be careful about your dreams, going back towards the start of what we were saying. But second, telling about them and all that sorts of stuff. But usually when people are like, my holy guardian angel or whatever, told me, I have, basically this charge over you to command you to do this, pay attention closer, and you usually notice that that's not even the experience they had. They're throwing that judgment on top of that. But Caesar, now returning from his command, and designing to get the consulship, and seeing that Crassus and Pompey were again at variance, was unwilling to disoblige one by making application to the other, and despaired of success without the help of one of them. He therefore made it his business to reconcile them, making it appear that by weakening each other's influence they were prompting the interest of the Ciceros, the Catuli, and the Catas, which would really be of no account if they would join their interests and their factions, and act together in public with one policy and one united power, and so reconciling them by his persuasions, out of the three parties he set up one irresistible power, which utterly subverted the government both of Senate and people. Not that he made either Pompey or Crassus greater than they were before, but by their means made himself greatest of all, for by the help of the adherents of both he was once gloriously declared consul, which office, when he had administered with credit, they decreed him the command of an army, and allotted him Gaul for his province, and so placed him as it were in the citadel, not doubting but they should divide the rest at their pleasure between themselves when they had confirmed him in his allotted command. Pompey was actuated in all this by an immoderate desire of ruling, but Crassus, adding to his old disease of covetousness a new passion after trophies and triumphs, emulous of Caesar's exploits, not content to be beneath him in these points, though above him in all others, could not be at rest till it ended in an ignominious overthrow and a public calamity. When Caesar came out of Gaul to Lucca, a great many went thither from Rome to meet him. Pompey and Crassus had various conferences with him in secret, in which they came to the resolution to proceed still more decisive steps, and to get the whole management of affairs into their hands. Caesar to keep his army, and Pompey and Crassus to obtain new ones and new provinces, to effect all which there was but one way, to getting the consulate a second time, which they were to stand for, and Caesar to assist them by writing to his friends and sending many of his soldiers to vote. But when they returned to Rome, their design was presently suspected, and a report was soon spread that this interview had been for no good. When Marcellinus and Domitius asked Pompey in the Senate if he intended to stand for the consulship, he answered, "Perhaps he would, perhaps not," and being urged again, replied he would ask it of the honest citizens, but not of the dishonest, which answer appearing too haughty and arrogant, Crassus said, more modestly, that he would desire it if it might be for the advantage of the public, otherwise he would decline it. Upon this some others took confidence and came forward as candidates, among them Domitius, but when Pompey and Crassus now openly appeared for it, the rest were afraid and drew back. Only Cato encouraged Domitius, who was his friend and relation, to proceed, exciting him to persist, as though he was not defending the public liberty, as these men, he said, did not so much aim at the consulate as at arbitrary government, and it was not a petition for office, but a seizure of provinces and armies. And thus spoke and thought Cato, and almost forcibly compelled Domitius to appear in the forum, where many sided with them. For there was indeed much wonder and question among the people. Why should Pompey and Crassus want another consulship, and why they two together, and not with some third person? We have a great many men not unworthy to be fellow consuls with either the one or the other. Pompey's party, being apprehensive of this, committed all manner of indecencies and violences, and among other things lay in wait for Domitius, as he was coming thither before daybreak with his friends. His torchbearer they killed, and wounded several others, whom Cato was one, and there being beaten back and driven into a house, Pompey and Crassus were proclaimed consuls. Not long after, they surrounded the house with armed men, thrust Cato out of the forum, killed some that made resistance, and decreed Caesar his command for 5 years longer, and provinces for themselves. Syria and both the Spains which being divided by lots, Syria fell to Crassus, and Spain's to Pompey. All were well pleased with the change, for the people were desirous that Pompey should go far from the city, and he, being extremely fond of his wife, was very glad to continue there. But Crassus was so transported with his fortune that it was manifest he thought he had never had such good luck befall him as now, so that he had much to do to contain himself before company and strangers. But amongst his private friends he let fall many vain and childish words, which were unworthy of his age and contrary to his usual character, for he had been very little given to boasting hitherto. But then, being strangely puffed up and his head heated, he would not limit his fortune with Parthia and Syria, but looking on the actions of Lucullus against Tigranes, and the exploits of Pompey against Mithridates, as but child's play, he proposed to himself, in the hopes to pass as far as Bactria and India and the utmost ocean. Not that he was called upon by a decree which appointed him to his office to undertake any expedition against the Parthians, but it was well known that he was eager for it, and Caesar wrote to him out of Gaul, commending his resolution and inciting him to the war. And when Attaius, the tribune of the people, designed to stop his journey, and many others murmured that one man should undertake a war against a people that had done them no injury, and were at enmity with them, he desired Pompey to stand by him and accompany him out of the town, as had a great name among the common people. And when several were ready, prepared to interfere and raise an outcry, Pompey appeared with a pleasing countenance, and so mollified the people that they let Crassus pass quietly. Attaius, however, met him, and first by word of mouth warned and conjured him not to proceed, and then commanded his attendant officer to seize him and detain him. But the other tribunes not permitting it, the officer released Crassus. Attaius, the other tribunes not permitting it, the officer released Crassus. Attaius, therefore, running to the gate, when Crassus was come thither, and sent down a chafing dish with lighted fire in it, and burning incense, and pouring libations on it, cursed him with dreadful imprecations, calling upon and naming several strange and horrible deities. Or maybe in a different context, it's just names of deity that's considered to be, harsh ones, negative things. But it's hard to tell without knowing the exact right. In the Roman belief, there is so much virtue in these sacred and ancient rites that no man can escape the effects of them, and that the utterer himself seldom prospers, so that they are not often made use of, and but upon a great occasion, and Attaius was blamed at that time for resorting to them, as the city itself, in whose cause he used them, would be the first to feel the ill effects of these curses and supernatural terrors. Now, I believe in the threefold law of return to a degree, right? The curse that's not deserved, well, that can return upon the person who did the curse. Then there's the worrying. The more obvious thing that's more universal is people, it's like, when's it going to come to pass? When's this? And, that sort of stuff. And then there's, the guilt and shame and all that sort of stuff as a result. Now, is any of that necessary to happen with a curse? No. If you're careful with the curse, who and all that stuff, you may face none of that whatsoever. Crassus arrived at Brundusium, and though the sea was very rough, he had not patience to wait, but went on board and lost many of his ships With the remnant of his army he marched rapidly through Galatia, where, meeting with King Diotarus, who was, though he was very old, was building a new city, Crassus scoffingly told him, "Your Majesty begins to build at the 12th hour." Well, that's what you should do, right? Is that as long as you're living, have worthy deeds started. And in that case, you have some of it. You set up things where obviously it can be done without you to continue it, or at least consider that a possibility. "Neither do you," said he, "O general, undertake your Parthian expedition very early, for Crassus was then 60 years old, and he seemed older than he was." Did he drink more than other people? I don't know. That'd be saying something for the Greeks, right? Well, I'm sure they weren't all alcoholics, or they just make it sound like they all were. At his first coming things went as he would have them, for he made a bridge over Euphrates without much difficulty, and passed over his army in safety, and occupied many cities of Mesopotamia, which yielded voluntarily. But 100 of his men were killed in one, in which Apollonius was tyrant. Therefore, bringing his forces against it, he took it by storm, plundered the goods, and sold the inhabitants. The Greeks called the city Zenadatia, upon the taking of which he permitted the army to salute him imperator. But this was very ill thought of, and it looked as if he despaired a nobler achievement, that he made so much of this little success. Putting garrisons of 7,000 foot and 1,000 horse in the new conquests, he returned to take up his winter quarters in Saria, where his son was to meet him, coming from Casser out of Gaul, decorated with rewards for his valor, and bringing with him 1,000 select horse. Here Crassus seemed to commit his first error, and except indeed the whole expedition his greatest, for as he ought to have gone forward and seized Babylon and Seleucia, sites that were ever at enmity with the Parthians, he gave the enemy time to provide against him. Besides, he spent his time in Syria more like a usurer than a general, not in taking account of the arms and in improving the skill and discipline of his soldiers, but in computing the revenue of the cities, wasting many days in weighing by scale and balance and treasure that was in the temple of Hierapolis, issuing requisitions for levies and soldiers upon particular towns and kingdoms, and then again withdrawing them on payment of sums of money, by which he lost his credit and became despised. Here, too, he met with the first ill omen from that female entity, whom some call Venus, others Juno, others Nature, are the cause that produces out of moisture the first principles and seeds of all things, and gives mankind their earliest knowledge of all that is good for them. For as they were going out of the temple, young Crassus stumbled, and his father fell upon him. When he drew his army out of winter quarters, ambassadors came to him from Arsacus with this short speech: if the army was sent by the people of Rome, he denounced mortal war. But if, as he understood was the case, against the consent of his country, Crassus, for his own private profit, had invaded his territory, then their king would be more merciful, and taking pity upon Crassus's dotage, would send those soldiers back who had been left, not so truly to keep guard on him as to be his prisoners. Crassus boastfully told them he would return his answer at Seleucia, upon which Vagises, the eldest of them, laughed and showed the palm of his hand, saying, "Hair will grow here before you will see Seleucia." So they returned to their king Rhodes, telling him it was war. Several of the Romans that were in garrison in Mesopotamia, with great hazard, made their escape, and brought word that the danger was worth consideration, urging their own eyewitnesses of the numbers of the enemy and the manner of their fighting. When they had assaulted their towns, and as men's manner is, made all seem greater than really it was, by flight it was impossible to escape them, and as impossible to overtake them when they fled, and they had a new and strange sort of darts, as swift as sight, for they pierced whatever they met with, before you could see who threw them. Their men-at-arms were so provided that their weapons would cut through anything, and that their armor gave way to nothing. All which when the soldiers heard, their hearts failed them, for until now they thought there was no difference between the Parthians and the Armenians or Cappadocians, whom Lucullus grew weary with plundering, and had been persuaded that the main difficulty of the war consisted only in the tediousness of the march, and the trouble of chasing men that durst not come to blows, so that the danger of a battle was beyond their expectation. Accordingly, some of the officers advised Crassus to proceed no further at present, but reconsider the whole enterprise, amongst whom in particular was Cassius the quaestor. The soothsayers also told him privately that the signs found in the sacrifices were continually adverse and unfavorable, but he paid no heed to them or to anybody who gave any other advice than to proceed, nor did Artabazes, king of Armenia, confirmed him a little, who came to his aid with 6,000 horse, who, however, were said to be only the king's lifeguard and suite, for he promised 10,000 cuirassiers more, and 30,000 foot at his own charge. He urged Crassus to invade Parthia by the way of Armenia, for not only would he be able there to supply his army with abundant provisions, which he would give him, but his passage would be more secure in the mountains and hills with which the whole country was covered, making it almost impassable to horse, in which the main strength of the Parthians consisted. Crassus returned him but cold thanks for his readiness to serve him, and for the splendor of his assistance, and told him he was resolved to pass through Mesopotamia, where he had left a great many brave Roman soldiers, whereupon the Armenian went his way. As Crassus was taking his army over the river at Siugema, he encountered preternaturally violent thunder, and the lightning flashed in the faces of the troops, and during the storm a hurricane broke upon the bridge, and carried part of it away. 2 thunderbolts fell upon the very place where the army was going to encamp, and one of the general's horses, magnificently caparisoned, dragged away the groom into the river, and was drowned. It is said that when they went to take up the first standard, the eagle of itself turned its head backwards, and after he had passed over his army, and as they were distributing provisions, the first thing they gave was lentils and salt, which, with the Romans, are the food proper to funerals, and are offered to the dead. And as Crassus was haranguing his soldiers, he let fall a word which was thought very ominous in the army. "For I am going," he said, "to break down the bridge, that none of you may return." And whereas he ought, when he had perceived his blunder, to have corrected himself and explained his meaning, seeing the men alarmed at the expression, he would not do it out of mere stubbornness. And when at the last general sacrifice the priest gave him the entrails, they slipped out of his hand, and when he saw the standers-by concerned at it, he laughed and said, "See what it is to be an old man, but I shall hold my sword fast enough." So he marched his army along the river with 7 legions, a little less than 4,000 horse, and as many light-armed soldiers, as the scouts returning declared that not one man appeared, but that they saw the footing of a great many horses, which seemed to be retiring in flight. Whereupon Crassus conceived great hopes, and the Romans began to despise the Parthians as men that would not come to combat hand to hand. But Cassius spoke with him again, and advised him to refresh his army in some of the garrison towns, and remain there till they could get some certain intelligence of the enemy, or at least to make towards Seleucia, and keep by the river, so that they might have the convenience of having provision constantly supplied by the boats, which might always accompany the army, and the river would secure them from being environed, and if they should fight, it might be upon equal terms, while Crassus was still considering, and as yet undermined. There came to the camp an Arab chief called Ariamnes, probably no S at the end, Arimin, or what would his name been if he was Arab? A cunning and willing fellow, who, of all the evil chances which combined to lead them on to destruction, was the chief and the most fatal. Some of Pompey's old soldiers knew him, and remembered him to have received some kindness of Pompey, and have been looked upon as a friend of the Romans. But he was now suborned by the king's generals, and sent Crassus to entice him, if possible, from the river and the hills into the wide open plain, where he might be surrounded. For the Parthians desired anything rather than to be obliged to meet the Romans face to face. He therefore, coming to Crassus, and he had a persuasive tongue, highly commended Pompey as his benefactor, and admired the forces that Crassus had with him, but seemed to wonder why he delayed, and made preparations, as if he should not use his feet more than any arms, against men that, taking with them their best goods and chattels, had designed long ago to fly for refuge to the Scythians, or Hyrcanians, the Hyperborean people. If you meant to fight, you should have made all possible haste before the king should recover courage and collect his forces together. At present, you see Serena and Seleucus opposed to you, to draw you off in pursuit of them, while the king himself keeps out of the way. But this was all a lie, for Herodes had divided his army in two parts. With one, he in person visited Armenia, revenging himself upon Artavasdes, and sent Serena against the Romans, not out of contempt, as some pretend, for there is no likelihood that he should despise Crassus, one of the chiefest men of Rome, to go and fight with Artavasdes and invade Armenia, but much more probably he really apprehended the danger, and therefore waited to see the event, intending that Serena should first run the hazard of a battle and draw the enemy on. Nor was this Serena an ordinary person, but in wealth, family, and reputation the second man in the kingdom, and in courage and prowess the first, and for bodily stature and beauty no man like him. Whenever he traveled privately, he had 1,000 camels to carry his baggage, 200 chariots for his concubines, 1,000 completely armed men for lifeguards, and a great many more light armed, and he had at least 10,000 horsemen altogether of his servants and retinue. The honor had long belonged to his family, and at the king's coronation he put the crown upon his head, and when this very king Herodes had been exiled, he brought him in. It was he also that took the great city of Seleucia, was the first man that scaled the walls, and with his own hand beat off the defenders. And though at this time he was not above 30 years old, he had a great name for wisdom and sagacity. And indeed, by these qualities chiefly he overthrew Crassus, who first through his overweening confidence, and afterwards because he was cowed by his calamities, fell a ready victim to his subtlety. When Ariamnes had thus worked upon him, he drew him from the river into vast plains by a way that at first was pleasant and easy, but afterwards very troublesome, by reason of the depth of the sand, no tree, nor any water, and no end of this to be seen, so that they were not only spent with thirst and the difficulty of the passage, but were dismayed with the uncomfortable prospect of not a bough, not a stream, not a hillock, not a green herb, but in fact a sea of sand which encompassed the army with its waves.